the smart person that you're likely to meet in your life has an IQ of around 145.
Yeah.
160 is getting pretty damn rare. And Trump's old, and IQ goes down with age, fluid IQ, although crystallized IQ either stays the same or goes up slightly.
Now, Peterson does not go out on a limb to give an estimated range for Trump's IQ. But what do you think Donald Trump's intelligence is and his estimated IQ? Where would you put it?
Well, I think it goes without saying that he would at least qualify for Mensa. There's plenty of evidence for that, of course, not least his success as a negotiator and a businessman, to which Jordan alludes. Even with his appreciable head start in life, and I'm talking about being born into a family of multimillionaires, that his family had hundreds of millions of dollars, even when he was a kid, he couldn't have expanded his holdings in the various directions he chose with a mere double-digit IQ, which we sometimes hear attributed to him. You need not be a sublime genius to juggle all of the irons that he has in the fire and has had in the fire, but you can't exactly be a chimp either. You know what I mean? In Trump's world, smart people are always trying to take advantage of you and come out on top. And you can't defend yourself from them without meeting a certain threshold standard of intellectual ability. And Trump obviously meets that standard. How high is that standard? Well, that's up to debate. As far as how Trump was able to do this and why people sometimes get the idea that he's not as smart as he actually is, well, have you ever heard of the double life strategy? That's something that I believe was discussed in that Esquire article that they did on us in 1998. You remember that article, right? It was about, how did Chris Langan actually survive in the rough and tumble world of being a bar bouncer and construction work and so forth, while at the same time doing high caliber genius quality work. I talked to the author about my double life strategy. And that's where a very intelligent person realizing that he has to communicate effectively with those around him in order to be successful or just not to get fired from your job or gather a lot of resentment and ostracism that you don't need. In order to avoid that, you adopt their verbal mannerisms and habits of expression so as to blend in and be accepted in their circles and smoothly interact with. In New York, where I lived for over 25 years, that means Trump-style vernacular and plentiful hand gestures. You know how Trump stands up there and he waves his hands and he's constantly using, very stylistic mannerisms and New York, but sometimes amounts to Brooklyn gutter language at times. If you have the luxury of existing in an isolated, privileged, snowflake-populated bubble world of the kinds that proliferate in the academic, artistic, political, corporate spheres, for example, you can avoid that. You can talk you can use 50-cent words, whenever you open your mouth if you want to. But in Trump's world, he couldn't do that. So he had to have this double life thing where he could switch. It's a little switch inside Trump where he elevates his discourse only when he can afford to do so. The rest of the time, he's talking in the vernacular to ordinary people like construction workers with whom he had to communicate, people in the business world, many of whom aren't the brightest bulbs on the Christmas tree. This is what he had to do to get by, doing what he did for a living. Many people disagree with Trump's ideas and policy proposals on philosophical grounds, of course, and that's fine as long as they don't confuse philosophical grounds with ad hominem attacks on his intelligence, which is what we hear quite a lot of. Even before all of this criticism of Joe Biden and his possible dementia came up, people were talking the other way around as though Trump was the one who was dementing. And in fact, Trump shows no signs whatsoever of dementia, and he's obviously a highly intelligent man. He started out that way, so he originally had it, he hasn't lost it, and he still has it. Trump's IQ is probably at least as high as that of the typical professional academic, and higher than that of the typical Harvard student. Now, as I recall, when a sample of Harvard undergraduates was given an abbreviated version of the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, their mean IQ came up as just a bit under 130, with a range of 95 to 150. That's lower than would be estimated from the SAT scores of Harvard students, by the way, but the SAT, of course, is not an IQ test. It's got an element of IQ in it, correlates to a certain extent, but above a certain level, the correlation it peters out. Now, the mean IQ of tenured college professors is obviously, I won't say obviously, it's probably around 135 or so. which is pretty high. Interestingly, this is what we've sometimes called the danger zone, or about 2 to 3 standard deviations above the mean, with a little padding on either end, of course. Being in the danger zone makes you smart enough to have become convinced of your own intellectual superiority, but insufficiently smart to realize that this may only be because of the rarity of much better minds than yours in your immediate vicinity. There are many better minds than the average danger zone persons in the world, but they're relatively unlikely to have met any of them. The probability of them coming together and coming to this realization requires a level of metacognitive ability that many danger zone inhabitants seem to lack. Danger zone intelligence also feeds into one's personality profile. It unrealistically inflates one's self-confidence and/or narcissism, and overrules caution when it comes to making errors of conception or calculation. Worse than that, because investing in one's own intelligence comes down to investing in one's own ideas and opinions, danger zone intelligence can make one latch on to one's own intellectual content, what one believes or what one would like to think, like a bulldog with lockjaw. These people fiercely clamp on to their ideas, like a bulldog, and oftentimes this means clamping down on their misconceptions as well, even in the face of superior reasoning. They can't recognize the superior reasoning because they're working on the assumption that they're the smartest person in the room 24/7. That's the way they approach life. That's what makes them danger zone people. No matter how you talk about it, this comes down to extreme identification with one's ideas. You actually invest yourself in your ideas. That's what intelligent people tend to do. This is certainly true of people in the danger zone, and that causes them to be triggered by any form of criticism, either explicit or implied. And they're just very sensitive to any hint that they might not be as smart as they think they are. And this is exactly what they have to realize. In order to break out of the danger zone, they have to realize that no, they're not necessarily the smartest people ever, even though they're smarter than most of the others they meet.